It carries one of the most iconic names in aviation, Black Hawk.
It did everything we wanted it to do.
Infamous for a tragedy and revered as a lifesaver.
Had this been another type of helicopter, probably none of the crews would have survived.
The UH-60 Black Hawk is Army tough.
It just can give you everything in that split second when you need it.
This is the inside story of how a military workhorse got off the ground and set a new standard for getting in and getting out through the heat of battle. In 2011, America's war in Afghanistan barrels into its 10th year. One of its deadliest places, Kunar Province. U.S. attention focuses on its remote Wadapur Valley.
It was a very active insurgent area, especially with it being near the border of Pakistan.
U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Julia Stalker was in Kunar as a flight medic.
It was a very easy place for them to hide out and operate because of the terrain.
On top, coming back down.
U.S. commanders hatch a dangerous plan to attack the Taliban on their home turf. They must prepare for U.S. casualties. Medical teams ready 2 Black Hawk helicopters for airlifting wounded from the heat of battle.
We were going to be very, very busy.
June 25th, high on a ridgeline, Operation Hammerdown opens and meets intense enemy fire. Troops push toward the valley below, but Taliban bullets pin them down.
We got disrupted. We set up a defensive position, and we've just been in the defense.
Already, soldiers are down and in desperate need of help. The Black Hawks swoop into action. The Black Hawk is the go-to helicopter for medics on a mission. And for good reason.
This helicopter that we have right here is our medevac helicopter. It's an HH-60. It's specifically designed for medevac missions.
It fits up to 6 stretchers for the wounded, 2 crew members, and life-saving equipment, all in a cabin of 88 square feet.
So even with our space constraints, I am able to provide care just like almost any emergency room would.
Medevac Blackhawks can save lives if they can get to the patients. In the Wadapur Valley, 2 Blackhawks race towards the injured. One shot soldier's condition is critical. The longer troops stay put with the wounded, the bigger target they all become. The 2 helicopters arrive over a hot battlefield.
There was small arms fire, RPGs. It was a very, very active battlefield. It's a vision in my mind that will never go away.
Insurgents hit the first Black Hawk. They seriously damage hydraulics critical to flight performance. Pilot muscle alone isn't enough power to control a Black Hawk's main rotor or tail rotor. 2 hydraulic systems, plus a third backup system, run from nose to tail for the heavy lifting. Hydraulic fluid flows through pumps, valves, and lines to supply 3,050 pounds per square inch of pressure. If one system goes down, the backups kick in. But it's only a temporary fix for a potentially lethal problem. With crucial systems gone, the first Black Hawk must return to base. Stalker's medevac helicopter now operates solo.
What was going through my mind was, oh man, we're the only ones left.
Stalker's crew must get the injured soldiers on board. But gunfire below makes it impossible. They hover out of range, around 11,000 feet, and sit tight.
So we had to wait. We burned fuel and we waited for that call that we were going to be able to get in and pull our patients out.
The high altitude would make this waiting game impossible for many helicopters, but not the Black Hawk. 2 GE turboshaft engines put out more than 1,800 horsepower each. They spin 4 blades. Each pair measures a whopping 54 feet from tip to tip. This power keeps the Black Hawk flying, even at dizzying heights. That's comfort in the sky, but Stalker's Black Hawk needs to get on the ground. Casualties mount.
All we needed was about 2 minutes. We needed 2 minutes of it being quiet.
It's bad weather, and as dusk turns to darkness, the danger grows. Finally, U.S. attack aircraft strike. Enemy fire continues, but it's cover enough for Stalker's Black Hawk to attempt a second rescue.
It was a very precision landing in a very unprecise place.
They find a narrow opening between trees on the side of a mountain and hover with one wheel on the roof of a house, just long enough to load a critically wounded soldier. Stalker's team stabilizes him and gets him to surgery in time to save his life.
It is the coolest aircraft out there for this particular mission.
Stalker credits the Black Hawk for their success. The Army credits her and her crew. They each receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. Since the Black Hawk was introduced, battlefield survival has risen 75%. The Army Surgeon General identified the need for such an aerial lifesaver in World War II. In the Korean War, helicopter evacuations saved some 40,000 lives. They not only served as air ambulances, they doubled as aerial troop carriers.
Air mobility is a concept that comes out of the 1950s.
Roger Connor is Rotary Wing Curator at the National Air and Space Museum.
Early on, it was called Sky Cavalry, and the idea was just like the horse troops of the Old West. The Army was going to get out there and intercept the enemy before they could get into the cities and cause trouble. And to do that, they needed the helicopter instead of horses.
The need for helicopter support hits home more than ever in the Vietnam War. 1971. America has been caught up in the bloody war in Vietnam for 7 years. The Army has 165,000 troops on the ground and the latest in air transport to get them around. The Army's go-to helicopter is the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, commonly called the Huey.
The Huey had a number of advantages going for it. It was a simple aircraft, and most importantly, it was cheap and easy to build.
The Huey is front and center during almost every battle of the war, making it a prime target.
About 2,500 Hueys, or about half the total that served in Vietnam, were actually shot down at one time or another. And so if the aircraft went down on impact, it was not as survivable as it might be.
The Huey's performance falls short in other ways too. Its engine can't take the heat.
Vietnam was an extremely difficult environment for helicopters. Temperatures were very high. The humidity was often over 95%. To operate in those conditions really required an engine that was going to generate a lot of excess thrust to carry it through that difficult environment.
As the temperature goes up, the Huey's ability to transport troops goes down.
If it was hot and humid, you couldn't carry as many troops on an individual sortie, so you would have to fly more runs to bring more troops in, and that greatly complicated the missions.
Without a way to rapidly move troops, the Army quickly loses ground.
Towards the end of the Vietnam War, the Army realized the Huey was not going to be adequate for its next generation of operations.
January 5th, 1972, Washington, D.C. The Army announces a competition to build a new generation utility and medevac helicopter. It needs to have long-range ability, lift heavy cargo, carry 11 or more fully equipped troops in the back, and serve as an aerial ambulance. It must be able to do all of that in the heat of battle and survive. The new helicopter will eventually replace more than 1,000 Hueys in the Army inventory.
The limitations of the Huey forced the Army to issue new requirements, ones that would deal with the shortcomings in survivability, with the shortcomings in cabin space and in payload, and in speed and in range.
3 well-known names in aviation vie for the prize: Bell, Boeing Vertol, and Sikorsky. Sikorsky is the long shot.
The U.S. Army had been buying thousands of helicopters from Bell and from Boeing during the Vietnam War, but it only bought very small numbers from Sikorsky during that time. So most of the Army program managers of the Pentagon at that time did not see Sikorsky as a realistic contender for their new major competition.
8 months later, the Army narrows the field to 2 designs: Boeing Vertol and Sikorsky. To determine the winner, a fly-off.
The 2 major contenders had to produce a prototype aircraft, and they would fly off. The aircraft that flew best would be the one that usually won.
This strategy leads to a most extraordinary game changer. A crash landing like none before it. The Army gives Boeing Vertol and Sikorsky 4 years for each of them to manufacture a helicopter. The best one will win a contract worth tens of millions.
The Army's philosophy was they would fund the design and development of 2 different helicopters, fly those against each other, and pick the winner for production.
Ray Leone was Chief of Advanced Concepts at Sikorsky Aircraft. Their new helicopter was his baby.
Sikorsky saw it as truly a matter of survival. We had to win, or we were faced with going out of business.
Sikorsky is a company in trouble. Their production lines only operate at 22% capacity. Their very existence depends on them winning the final contract. Sikorsky's strategy is to rigorously test each individual component for survivability before they assemble. They test and improve, straining parts to the breaking point and shooting bullets into almost every section of the airframe. But how will it compare to its competitor? March 1976. Boeing Vertol delivers its prototype, the YUH-61A. Its modular design meets all the Army's requirements, and it has a smaller rotor. This may make it cheaper and more versatile in tight spaces.
We knew the Boeing Vertol machine was slightly smaller than ours, so we worried that they may have a leg up on us. But there's no question in our minds that we did the best possible job in delivering to the Army what they truly wanted and needed.
5 months later, at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the operational stage of the fly-off begins. That means live cargo.
The operational testing consisted of flying simulated troop assault missions, going during the day, flying at night, and it was to put the helicopter in as close to an operational environment as possible, using real troops, real pilots, and just seeing how the aircraft behaved.
August 19th, 1976. In its critical test, the helicopter takes off, loaded with 14 Army personnel. Suddenly, in the middle of the flight, it begins to vibrate uncontrollably.
It was what was called a once per revolution, 1 per rev vibration. Low frequency, but very strong. They felt that since they didn't know what was causing it, and it seemed to be getting worse, they better land as quickly as possible.
Pilots spot a cornfield. It looks ideal for an emergency landing. But in the dark, they get it wrong.
Between the mist and the darkness, they mistook the pine trees for corn stalks.
The helicopter crashes hard into the trees. Aboard, 2 pilots and 12 soldiers.
I answered the phone 1 o'clock in the morning at home, and they said, one of your helicopters just crashed in the woods and was full of Army troops. And I said, well, what were the injuries? Were there any fatalities? And they said, sorry, we can't tell you that. You better get down to Fort Campbell just as quickly as you can.
Leone, rescue teams, and Army investigators race to the scene. It's not what anyone expected.
There were no fatalities. In fact, there were no injuries.
More than that, the helicopter shows little damage.
There was some dents and nicks and tears on the airframe, but nothing substantially wrong.
The cause of the vibration is an easy fix, and 3 days later, the crashed helicopter flies out of the forest and back to base. What could have been its demise becomes a moment of triumph.
The August 1976 crash was one of the few moments in aviation history where a crash has been very fortunate. In this case, the crash demonstrated the real survivability to an extent that no other demonstration could have done.
2 later crash landings prove the point even further. This is a Huey, the helicopter to be replaced. And this is Sikorsky's new helicopter, also hitting tail first. The strength of the new airframe is hard to beat.
I'm rather pleased to announce to you that the Army has selected Sikorsky Aircraft as the winner of the UTAS competition.
Sikorsky wins the deal. They ink a 3-year, $83.4 million production contract to build 368 helicopters. On Halloween 1978, the Army gets a treat. The first Sikorsky production model arrives on its doorstep. They uphold a tradition of christening the helicopters with Native American names. They call it the Black Hawk. The Army immediately starts transitioning Huey pilots to fly the latest in combat utility helicopters. But each pilot wonders, will the Black Hawk live up to expectations when it matters most? In combat. October 1983, Grenada. A Marxist power struggle explodes in the tiny Caribbean nation. The United States fears Grenada could become a communist stronghold. President Ronald Reagan reacts with force.
Early this morning, forces from 6 Caribbean democracies and the United States began a landing or landings on the island of Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean.
It's the first conflict since Vietnam, and the pressure is on for a quick victory. To get troops there fast, the Army selects its newest air asset, the Black Hawk. October 25th, 9 fully loaded Black Hawks take off from neighboring Barbados. Commanders tasked 2 of them with a high-level rescue mission.
The mission was to insert 15 Navy SEALs to the Governor General's mansion and to secure him there.
Major Bob Johnson was a company commander and Black Hawk pilot in Grenada.
There had been murders and killings, and the Governor General and his wife were pretty much trapped in his mansion.
The American Army doesn't expect much resistance.
We had been told that they would lay down their arms and give up when they saw us coming.
Not long after the Black Hawks reach Grenada, they discover their intelligence is wrong.
Well, as we flew on to landfall, we started picking up a tremendous amount of ground fire. We were pretty much taking it from every direction with pretty much everything they had, so it made things a little tense.
The Black Hawks maneuver through the gunfire. Finally, they arrive over the governor's mansion.
We kicked out the fast ropes, and the SEALs went down the fast ropes.
But as the SEALs unload, so does the enemy.
Somebody opened up on our aircraft from directly below with an AK-47.
A blast of bullets hits the Black Hawk. But what may have been fatal to another helicopter is not here. Seats made from boron carbide armor save the pilot. But it's not over.
Aircraft is designed to survive small arms fire. It doesn't mean that it can't be penetrated.
As Johnson maneuvers away, an enemy fighter hits his target.
One round came up just beyond the edge of the seat. My leg flew up off the floor, and it looked like you took a hunk of hamburger about the size of a softball, put a firecracker in it, and set it off inside the cockpit. At that point, I knew that things weren't going real well.
The bullets keep flying, but so does the Black Hawk. When one of the Black Hawk's 2 fuel tanks takes a hit, instead of exploding or leaking, it employs a technology developed for aircraft before World War II. Layers of rubber and sealant cover the inside wall of the Black Hawk's 2 connecting fuel cells. When bullets pierce them, the rubber instantaneously returns to its original position and fills the holes. The Black Hawk takes this technology a step beyond the tanks. It also has self-sealing fittings that connect self-sealing fuel lines. These fittings are a world first. Johnson doesn't have to worry about the fuel leaks, but nothing aboard will plug the hole in his leg.
We had been briefed that if anybody needed medical evacuation, that the Navy was in the area, the USS Guam was available, so the other pilot decided we were going to fly to the Guam, so that's where we went.
The beat-up Black Hawk flies fast toward the USS Guam. 15 minutes later, it lands on deck, where emergency crews seen here act fast. Before the Black Hawk, post-crash fires were a #1 cause of crew death. But no more.
They took me down to the sick bay, pumped me full of morphine, prepped me for surgery.
Maintainers tally the battle damage to the helicopter.
Depending on how you count the bullet holes, somewhere between 42 and 48 bullet holes in my Black Hawk.
It's an incredible tally. The Black Hawk proves it's a tough bird to kill in combat. In just 4 days, Black Hawks fly dozens of combat missions. They whisk away the governor, help rescue more than 700 American citizens, and transport troops to secure the island.
After Grenada, I think everyone viewed the Black Hawk as an aircraft that could take a tremendous amount of punishment, that could be counted on to get you where you're going, to accomplish your mission and bring you back home safely.
It's a baptism of fire and a swift victory. But a 4-day invasion in the tropics sounds like a vacation compared to what comes 7 years later. February 1991, Iraq. After 5 weeks of airstrikes, coalition forces gear up for the next phase of Operation Desert Storm. A hard-hitting response to dictator Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf readies his forces for a bold move.
The mission was to get as deep into Iraq as we could and as fast as we could in order to block possible reinforcements coming down from the Baghdad area into the battle space down near Kuwait.
U.S. Army General James Hill was a commander during Operation Desert Storm.
In order to do that, you had to get about 250 miles inside Iraq.
Commanders need U.S. attack helicopters to block enemy movement deep inside Iraq. But there's a hitch.
It was a refueling issue. You needed a gas station halfway between to refuel the helicopters. Simply put, the helicopter couldn't do the operation without the refuel point. So it was absolutely critical.
There are no desert gas stations to service an American invasion force. So mission planners decide to build one, 93 miles behind enemy lines. They call it Forward Operating Base Cobra.
The whole purpose of FOB Cobra was to seize a piece of ground, bring about 450,000 gallons of fuel into the desert and put it out there so that we could then logistically resupply the other assets of the division as it had to go forward out into the battle space.
Iraq has the 4th largest army in the world. Sneaking into the country to build a gas station won't be easy. Commanders call on the Black Hawk. But the helicopter is unproven in a desert environment. The new enemy, sand.
Sand in general was always an issue because you get sand ingested into the turbine parts, into the rotor parts. Sand was always a major concern.
The entire outcome of Desert Storm could hinge on this refueling base being ready for the invasion force. And it's counting on the Black Hawk to make it happen. February 24th, 1991, 7:30 a.m. Tactical Assembly Point Campbell, Saudi Arabia. 60 troop-laden Black Hawks from the 101st Airborne Division take off for their 93-mile flight into Iraq. It's the first wave of the largest air assault in military history.
We had to do the refueling point almost immediately because we wanted to put attack assets very quickly out beyond where we were at FOB Cobra. The biggest threat that we feared was enemy air defense systems along the route. I mean, we'd done a lot of looking from satellites and that kind of stuff, but you never know for sure what's there. It is a big piece of desert, and we had never flown it the whole way, so we didn't know, so we were concerned about that.
Black Hawk pilots speed across 90-plus miles of desert in 40 minutes at just 10 feet above the ground. as they prepare to land, a shock discovery. An entire enemy battalion is located right where Black Hawk pilots plan to establish the crucial refueling base.
400 plus Iraqi soldiers who started, and they were in dug-in positions, and they started firing at us.
"400 armed Iraqi soldiers firing is too much for the average Black Hawk. The helicopters have door gunners, but not much more. The Army sends in reinforcements.
We rolled in some Air Force 500-pound bombs on them, and with the first or second bomb, they said, "Ah!" waved their white flag and said, "We're out, and we quit. We're done."
The area clear, the Black Hawks swoop in with more than 500 troops and equipment to establish the refueling depot.
Almost the very first thing we put on the ground, a bunch of fuel pumps, because we knew we had to have gas pretty quickly.
Within an hour, the new base is pumping gas. Attack helicopters can now refuel here and fly deeper into Iraq. The Black Hawks continue to help build and supply the base.
The gas station was completed within 24 hours, well within 24 hours. And the Black Hawk was essential to the success of that mission. Simply could not have been done without the Black Hawk.
The U.S. invasion force refuels at this base and goes on to pound the enemy on their own turf. 100 hours later, over.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met.
The ever-present threat of sand thwarted by Black Hawk ground crews.
It is not an uncomplicated piece of machinery, the Black Hawk. It has to be cared for and maintained well. The dedication of both the crew chiefs and the soldiers and the maintainers of them was pretty incredible.
To keep it flying in top shape, Army maintainers must know the Black Hawk down to the bolts.
This aircraft is probably one of the most sophisticated air troop transport helicopters that the United States has. Just our pre-flight checklist alone just has over 100 different things. Power on checks as well as maintenance checks, and that's before you start cranking the engines. It's very thorough.
Even in the toughest combat environments, commanders expect Black Hawks to be ready to go at a moment's notice.
Usually when sand gets sucked up into the engines, it'll degrade the performance of the engines. So it's very, very important to maintain those engines so you have max capability of a mission.
The Black Hawk performance in Desert Storm, from the covering force operation when we first got there until the day the war ended, is a remarkable story. It did everything we wanted it to do under some incredible environmental conditions.
The Black Hawk basks in glowing reviews from Desert Storm for nearly 2 years. Then, a tragic misadventure it'll never live down. (1993) Somalia. A 2-year-long civil war escalates in a nation seized by warlords. Severe famine and violence claim the lives of 500,000 and displace 1.5 million more.
Somalis have been condemned to wander in search of food for nearly 2 years, some because supplies simply ran out. Frantic crowds of people desperate to get what little food is available.
UN and U.S. relief efforts do little to curb rampant corruption and starvation.
The relief supplies that were supposed to be going to the population were actually winding up in the hands of the warlords, who were using them to buy narcotics and weapons and fueling the civil war that had totally torn apart this country.
The capital city of Mogadishu is the conflict's epicenter. Unruly gangs take over the town.
By the summer of 1993, the situation in Mogadishu had become critical. Attempts to rein in the warlords and instill a sense of peace in the capital had begun to fall apart.
Somalia's top warlord breaks a ceasefire agreement. His clan stages violent attacks on UN peacekeepers. The U.S. sends in an elite military group to bring down those responsible. 400 Special Forces troops arrive in Somalia. They're called Task Force Ranger. October 3rd, 4 Special Ops Blackhawks depart from Mogadishu. On board, Task Force Ranger commandos. Their aim, to capture a Somali warlord's top lieutenants.
The expectation was that this was going to be a snatch and grab operation. They would be in and out within a fairly short period of time before any effective response could be generated.
The Black Hawk pilots fly towards the heart of Mogadishu. All going to plan, the mission will be over and done within an hour.
Task Force Ranger thought it had the element of a surprise. They were expecting small numbers of forces, lightly armed.
Moments after the Blackhawks reach their target location, the mission goes terribly wrong.
As the Blackhawks arrived and began fast roping in the Delta Force operators, one of the aircraft was struck by an RPG, went out of control, and crashed several blocks nearby.
The attack kills both pilots. The 2 crew chiefs and the 2 Delta snipers on board lay injured, but alive.
Once the first Blackhawk goes down, the mission is totally changed. It becomes now a search and rescue operation. This means that instead of just snatching the couple lieutenants and getting back out, they're going to have to send in a response team on the ground to try and recover the injured personnel.
2 more Blackhawks hover nearby and await orders. But before they know it, the situation gets even worse. One Blackhawk already smolders in the streets of Mogadishu. 2 dead, 4 injured survivors. Then, one of the remaining Blackhawks also takes a hit.
One of the Blackhawks is also struck by an RPG, loses its tail rotor, and crashes into the street. Because the aircraft was so survivable, remarkably, some of the crew survived the impact.
Now, 2 Blackhawks are down, a mile apart. 3 crew members lay dead. 7 others are badly wounded and trapped.
They were wounded, they were alone in the middle of the street, and hundreds of Somalis were now converging on their position. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Durant, has broken his back, and he's attempting to fight off almost single-handedly this force. And in a remarkable act of heroism, one of the MH6 Little Birds that's supporting the operation drops a Delta sniper team in there. These guys know that there's almost no way that they're going to get out, yet that they go in and attempt to defend the crew.
Delta snipers Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart fight to protect the second downed crew.
After holding out as long as they could, Shugart and Gordon were wounded and then killed, defending the aircraft. Durant had attempted to resist as long as his ammunition held out, but he too was quickly overwhelmed and taken prisoner.
U.S. forces on the ground fight to reach both the fallen crews and start a gun battle with Somali mobs that rages through the night. Networks flash horrific images of the aftermath around the world.
The United States humanitarian mission has gone horribly wrong. 12 American servicemen dead in fighting Sunday, some of their bodies dragged through the streets. One U.S. helicopter pilot was taken captive and videotaped as he lay badly injured.
For the Black Hawk, it's a public relations disaster. And worse, It's the deadliest combat operation for the U.S. since the Vietnam War. American forces recover the remaining dead 3 days later. 8 days after that, commanders secure the release of Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant. But Army morale hits a low.
Unfortunately, this episode became known as the Black Hawk Down episode. This was the biggest black eye to the American military since the failed operation to rescue the hostages in Iran in 1980.
It's an ugly scar on the Black Hawk name. The chance to rebuild its reputation finally comes with a new conflict, where it must counter a more pervasive and far more lethal enemy. January 2007, Iraq. 168,000 Allied troops patrol the country. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, wreak lethal havoc on U.S. convoys. The only way to avoid the threat is to stay off the roads. One machine in particular is very good at doing just that: the Black Hawk.
People wanted to fly with us in the Black Hawk because they knew it was safer to be transported in the air than on the ground.
Captain Jennifer Johnston was a Black Hawk mission leader during Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Everybody that asked for a ride, we tried to give them a ride.
The troops catch on that they are safer in air transport than ground transport. Keeping up with demand exhausts the pilots.
We went to great lengths to keep as many people off the roads at that time as possible, and that meant more hours for our pilots. Sometimes they were flying 12, 13-hour days.
During Operation Iraqi Freedom, U.S. Black Hawks log hundreds of thousands of hours, carrying passengers high above the IED threat. The number of lives saved is too many to count. Since its debut 35 years ago, the Black Hawk has played a role in nearly every American conflict. 4 out of 5 U.S. military branches fly Black Hawk variations.
The Army's expectation when it bought the Black Hawk in the early 80s was very great, and it's been met in spades, period. I don't think we ever could have asked anything more of a piece of equipment that we bought.
Other countries use the Black Hawk too. They fly in every corner of the world, serving military and humanitarian efforts from Colombia to Japan.
30 countries around the world use Black Hawks in their inventory, so it's been an extraordinarily successful program.
For the U.S., the Black Hawk continues to evolve. Sikorsky has fitted out Black Hawks for attack. Some models can deploy a retractable probe, hook up to a fixed-wing tanker, and refuel mid-flight, dramatically increasing the helicopter's range for special operations. And in May 2011, Special Forces raid this compound and kill Osama bin Laden. They leave behind clues to the first operational stealth helicopter. Reports say a modified Black Hawk.
This is going to be the most specialized tool that we have in our toolbox. This is something you're only going to take out once in a while under very extraordinary scenarios.
After numerous upgrades, the Black Hawk stands as one of the safest helicopters in the U.S. arsenal. Now, engineers work to take pilots out of the equation altogether with the first unmanned Black Hawk.
In future conflicts, automation will play a much greater role. This includes unmanned helicopters, but also helicopters that are what are called optionally manned. This means helicopters that you could fly in with a pilot, But if things are too hazardous, you could send it in as a robot, just simply by.
The 4,000th Black Hawk model just rolled off the assembly line, and there is no end in sight. The Army expects the UH-60 Black Hawk to remain in service for decades to come.
Every combat operation that we have yields a lot of lessons learned, and it's much more survivable now than it was initially in 1983, and they're continuing to make improvements as they learn.
The Black Hawk is one of the hardest working helicopters in the U.S. inventory. Mission after mission, soldiers and engineers have learned from tragedies and expanded its capabilities. Daring, powerful, shockingly resilient, the UH-60 Black Hawk is the best in its class, getting America into and out of the fight, saving time and lives.